Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is the third episode of my series, Reading the First 1000 Penguins. But I think we should start with a little bit of a recap for those of you that haven't seen the first two episodes. I have made a playlist though, so if you would like to watch the series from the beginning, then by all means check out the playlist. It's called Reading the First 1000 Penguins. But let's do a little bit of a recap to see where we are up to. So, in the first two videos, we have talked about number one in the first 1000, that is Ariel by Andre Malroy, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. Number 6a, The Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie. 274, The Importance of Being Earnest, and Lady Windermere's Fan by Oscar Wilde. Number 297, Down and Out in Paris and London. Untouchable by Mulk Raj Anand, that is number 312. Jane Austen's Persuasion, number 427. We have discussed number 442, Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. 481, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. When I say we've talked about it, what I mean is that I've read the work or reread it, and then I've discussed it on this channel as part of the series. We have also discussed number 513, D.H. Lawrence's The Prussian Officer. It's a collection of short stories. We've talked about Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, number 524. Hiroshima by John Hersey, number 603. 616, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Number 746, The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Selected Letters of D.H. Lawrence, which is number 759. Number 834, another George Orwell book here, Animal Farm. Then we discussed Between the Acts by Virginia Woolf, number 896. The Trial by Franz Kafka, number 907. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, number 960. Another George Orwell, 1984, 972. And here is the website, thepenguinfirsteditions.com. Here you can go and have a look through the first 3,000, and you can see how many of them you yourself have read. And if you would like to read along in this series, this never-ending series, then please, by all means, check out this website. Comment down below which books in this 1000 you've read and which ones you enjoyed the most, any recommendations. I will be aiming to get hold of all of these and read all of them. And as I discussed in the first installment of the series, my aim is not to collect first editions of all of these books, but just to read each and every single title in whatever form and format I can get it. And that will mean that, because some of these are very much out of print, that will mean hunting down copies that might end up being first editions. But the point is to read the first 1000 Penguins, starting in 1935, and the book 1000 was published in July 1954. So if this video series tickles your fancy, please stick around, because today I'm going to discuss another 10 books from the series. So I found a secondhand bookseller online who was selling a box set of the first 10 Penguins, republished, so I'm not sure exactly when, and it just came in the mail, and I'm very excited to unbox it, so let's get into it. Okay, just have a look at how gorgeous these are. Republication of the first 10. So beautiful, really lovely and floppy. And we've discussed quite a few of these already on the channel. But there are a couple here that I haven't read, so I will be reading Madame Claire by Susan Ertz, William by E.H. Young, and it even comes with this little booklet to celebrate the 50 years since 1935. So maybe these were then published in 1985. But yeah, super stoked with these, and look forward to discussing more of them with you shortly. I'll just kick off the next part of this video by saying that it's probably going to take me the better part of 375 years to complete the series, and I appreciate any of you who stick around that long. I'm going to be old and grey with not more than 3 teeth in my head by the time we get to the bottom of the barrel, but that's the kind of booktube commitment that I believe in. So let's get cracking with 10 more books from the first 1000. Very, very much enjoyed these. Some of them were rereads. Some of them I was discovering for the first time, which is just what I love about taking on a challenge like this. And let's dive into number 3. This is Poet's Pub by Eric Linklater. Yeah, this is the kind of book that, you know, you just don't hear talked about. And that's a crying shame because it's absolutely brilliant. I had such a barrel of laughs reading this book. It is about a poet named Saturday Keith, Scottish poet of a sort of impoverished aristocratic background who writes horrendously bad poems, and he's a bit of a laughing stock of the literati at that time. It's set in the 1930s, I think. And he sort of out of desperation takes a job through a friend of his who is a novelist, and this novelist's mother is a very domineering, powerful, aristocratic woman who has built a beer empire, and she also owns a string of boutique English pubs, sort of boutique hotels, and yeah, one of them is called the Pelican, and it's dates back to Elizabethan times. There's a lot of sort of folklore around this pub, but she installs Saturday Keith as the sort of, yeah, the manager of this place, and it becomes a bit of a novelty. There's this kind of goofy poet who runs the Pelican, and the novel unfolds in and around the Pelican with a series of very memorable and quirky characters. There's an American professor and his daughter. There is a supposed Russian spy among them. There is a very acerbic and austere literary critic. There is a sort of querulous ancient dame. There are just, yeah, a host of very funny characters. And Eric Linklater, he also wrote a children's book called The Wind on the Moon, which I think is a really beautiful title. He was very successful in his day, and he's pretty much completely forgotten now. Linklater has got a very rich poetic vocabulary. There's words like jumbles, marchpane, sucket, cherry, gusto, celerity, verdant, verdigris, freshet, opalescence, goldfishness, pyramidal, addenda, node, garret, robustious, susurrus, mujik. There's a lot of really, really fantastic words. Hobbledehoy, cognate, stepney, sibilant, charabanc. Just fantastic, tasty, crispy words of a really wide range. Then the characters are very comically drawn, but there's also very skillful scene setting, and the plot actually gets quite gripping at a certain point. And it's not a perfect book. There are some flaws, and it's strange how uneven it can be at times. You can have a beautiful passage and a quite clumsy passage right alongside each other. So I felt like Linklater perhaps didn't have the most discerning editor. I'm very glad that Penguin Classics have made an edition of this, and if you haven't read it, I would really highly recommend it. Next, I'm going to discuss number 5, and that is The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is a Lord Peter Whimsy mystery. This was my first Sayers novel. And what an amazing woman she was. She was one of the first women to graduate from Oxford. She became a classical scholar. She wrote successful religious plays for the stage. She translated Dante. But then, as a bit of a side hustle, she wrote murder mysteries. And she had this kind of winning formula in the form of Lord Peter Whimsy. And he is this sort of cavalier, brilliant 40-year-old bachelor who is just sort of has nothing to do with his time. He's a lord, but he just likes to solve murder mysteries, and yeah, it's very well executed. I quite prefer Lord Peter Whimsy mystery to Poirot by Agatha Christie. That was one of her sort of formidable, funny characters that you could just rely on as a good lens and voice to write these novels. But I quite like Lord Peter Whimsy. He's very funny. And speaking of Agatha Christie, number 6 is The Mysterious Affair at Styles. This is the second Agatha Christie that we have covered in the series. The first one was A Murder on the Links, which was 6A. This is number 6, and I actually read it in this vintage reprint. And I normally write all over my books. You can see, yeah, I normally, especially, I fill these pages up with quotes and ideas, and then I dog-ear pages, I write in the margins. But with these first 10, they're such a lovely set. So I don't know, I'm just going to see. I couldn't bring myself to scribble all over this. And it's a murder mystery, so it's, it doesn't require as much like philosophical ruminating. But yeah, it's Poirot. I think this was actually the first Poirot. And yeah, it's what it says on the tin. It's a mysterious affair with lots of twists and turns. It's pretty entertaining. It's not a life-changing book. We're going to discuss number 27. That is My Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. I don't actually have my copy of this book. This was actually the first P.G. Wodehouse book that I read. It includes stories about his two very famous characters, Jeeves and Bertie Wooster. But it's not solely devoted to those two, and I thought the other characters, inchoate, maybe slightly less developed aristocratic airhead, an antecedent of Bertie Wooster, I found it to be less compelling, although I do think that Wodehouse works well in short form. There are times when he tries to link a bunch of stories into a novel, and that doesn't always come off. But yeah, for those of you that haven't read P.G. Wodehouse, he's a comic writer, at times very, very funny, and he really struck a bit of a winning formula with this pair of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves. Now, Bertie Wooster is a sort of youngish bachelor. He is a kind of flippant, ditzy, foppish millionaire who doesn't really have anything to do, and he gets himself into all kinds of tangles, and Jeeves is his manservant, who is very brainy and austere and calm, and so they balance each other quite well. There's a lot of irony, of course, because Wooster is this blundering moron, but he's super wealthy and all doors are open to him. And Jeeves is this absolutely brilliant man who is just like in servitude. And I think what Woodhouse does well is bringing to awareness those ironies. It's not propaganda against like the aristocracy, but you don't have to be a massively discerning reader to tell that comedy is poking fun at the idea of the English aristocracy. And Woodhouse, you might think, oh well, maybe he was just an aristocrat and that's why he wrote about this world. He had aristocratic lineage, but his parents weren't obscenely wealthy, and they were working in Singapore, and they kind of just dumped their 3 children at private schools in England, and then the kids would spend the holidays with these rich aunts and uncles. So they were sort of in and around the world of the landed gentry and the British upper classes, but he wasn't absolutely rinsed with cash. So I think that put him in a useful position to become a writer and write about these these ridiculous set plays. He uses a lot of exaggeration, a lot of inversion of expectations. So when Worcester's cottage burns down, he treats it very flippantly. But when there's some deranged and dictatorial aunt on the way to dinner uninvited, it's like this existential crisis, and that's a little bit the way that his humor operates. We actually going to discuss some other P.G. Woodhouse books in this video a little bit later on there towards the end of the first 1000 series. And I won't say really too much about them individually because he's the kind of writer that does blend together a little bit. We'll come back to Woodhouse shortly. Next is number 257, Graham Greene's lesser-known novel, It's a Battlefield. Now, I'm not going to hold up the copy that I read because it's part of this gigantic Graham Greene omnibus that I have, and my phone is currently resting on that omnibus, and I don't want to mess around with the angle. So I'll just show you over here or here, what the original copy looked like. Now, It's a Battlefield is, I think, Greene's bitterest, most cynical novel. It's so bleak. But I felt an interesting comparison arising when I was reading it. And that was a surprising comparison, and that was with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Now, Mrs. Dalloway takes place on one June day in London, and there's a whole cast of characters, and we sort of drift in and out of their minds, and it's this like sort of floaty, interwoven gossamer, this fine needlework of commingled lives and thoughts and feelings and fears, and they're linked by being in London on this day. They're linked by the church bells ringing. It's a gorgeous novel, and it's got a seriousness to it, but it's also got a lightness, a musicality, a lyrical sparkle. Now, Greene's It's a Battlefield takes place in London on one day. It's I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head what time of year that day is, but it's not a summer day. It's probably sort of November, I think. So it's dark and cold, but it's not festive at Christmas time. And there's also a host of characters, and we also weave in and out of their thoughts as they go about their day. Although now I'm doubting that it's one day. It might take place in the space of like a couple of days, but it's a very short, compact amount of time. But and we do have a bit of stream of consciousness happening in this novel as we have in Mrs. Dalloway. So I think that Greene was really influenced by her in writing this novel. Mrs. Dalloway was published in 1925, and It's a Battlefield was published in 1935 for the first time, 1934, 1935. And yeah, it doesn't have that lightness and that diaphanous glittering that Mrs. Dalloway has. It's like I said, very bleak, very gritty. We have a lot of recurring images of shuttered doors, shuttered windows, bolted and barred and gated rooms. We see the individual characters often through like very enclosed, locked spaces. It's very dark, and there's a real pervading hopelessness. And I struggled through this book. I was reading it for the first time, and I do love Graham Greene's work, and I really struggled. And then it really there was a kind of lubrication of that's a strange word to reach for, but I don't know how to say that. There was a kind of oiling of the gears that occurred towards the end, and it started to flow, and the tension started to rise, because I found the first 100 or so pages to be quite scattered. There's a lot of like newspapers blowing through these dark, cold streets, and I think that represents a little bit how the first half of the book feels. It feels very like blustery and scattered, and the characters are not really likable. They're all very self-focused, very much alone, and they're all sort of individuals trapped in a wider system. And it's quite a political novel. The brutal loneliness and sort of isolation of individuals. It's very much about the alienation of individual people in big city life. They're all childless. There's not a sense of family unity or warmth in this book. But like I said, it does really pick up pace towards the end. And Greene is just such an incredible writer. His use of simile is so refreshing and so just high quality, high standard. It's not lazy writing. And so that always is, as Steve Donahue would say, Graham Greene has money in the bank of Steve, or in this case, Graham Greene has money in the bank of Bren. I really, really admire him as a writer, and so even when I read lesser works, I have time. I always have time for Graham Greene. And there's a few other Graham Greenes in this first 1000. We've already discussed Brighton Rock, which is very good. Also a very dark and bleak novel. Check out I think maybe even episode 1 or episode 2 where I discussed that novel. And there are other Graham Greenes that we will discuss. So I'm going to move on now. Next is number 425, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. I was very happy to see a Jane Austen book in this series, although and two. There are two, because we talked about Persuasion already. It's a pity that the rest of her novels are not in the first 1000 series. And I really enjoyed Northanger Abbey. In a similar way to the Graham Greene book I just discussed, it took me a while to get into Northanger Abbey. The central character, Catherine, she's this very, very naive girl from a small village who goes off to Bath, and this is her first encounter with society. And but you're sort of plodding along, and then the second half of the book really got very good, very, very good. I enjoyed it a lot. It's a kind of parody of the 18th century Gothic novels, but not parodic in the sense of just dismissing them out of hand. There was quite a popular opinion at that time of serious, male writers and scholars who would be very dismissive of the novel in general. And this is, in a way, Austen's love letter to the novel, while at the same time, having a very effective comic element. And the second half of the novel takes place in Northanger Abbey, which is, where we get the title of the novel from. And it's this kind of coming-of-age story, and it's a little bit implausible, the way that the plot comes together. I don't want to give too much away in case you haven't read this, but it's Jane Austen. She's just an incredible writer, and anything by her is worth your time. So yeah. Next, I'm going to discuss two P.G. Wodehouse books, like we've just talked about. Number 27, My Man Jeeves. I've got this fat omnibus. I'm going to mention Steve again because I think it was through him that I first came across this in one of his bookshelf tours or something like that. And it's a nice big floppy volume with nice big print. And it includes Thank You Jeeves, The Code of the Woosters, and The Inimitable Jeeves. And I've read all of these, all three of these, but Thank You Jeeves is not part of the Penguin 1000. And I have some quite strong things to say about that novel, but I'll save that for maybe for a bookshelf tour or something like that. So the Inimitable Jeeves is number 933, and The Code of the Woosters is number 935 in the Penguin 1000 series. There's actually quite a few other P.G. Wodehouse books in the series, so we will get to them in due course, but this was just what was ready to hand, so I thought I would discuss these today. The Code of the Woosters is more of really one story that unfolds, whereas the Inimitable Jeeves, if I remember correctly, is kind of short stories that are sort of strung together. It's very light and fun, but it's a bit like eating a bag of crisps. It's super enjoyable, but at some point you need a break. So I wouldn't recommend reading. In fact, I probably wouldn't even recommend reading a whole omnibus in one sitting. You might want to space it out a little bit, but he is very good at what he does. He's very funny, and there's a lot of irony in the sense that there's this power discrepancy, in terms of class and economic differences, but yet Jeeves is the smart one. And Bertie Wooster himself even says, if I had Jeeves's brains, I would have a stab at being prime minister or something. But yeah, of course, Jeeves is, those doors are closed. So there's a subtle criticism of the English class system. But if you're looking for radical revolutionary literature, this is not the place to go. But I'm a big advocate of reading very widely and not, you don't. If you agreed with everything that you read, I think you wouldn't expand your views. You also wouldn't find content to challenge, to allow you to clarify and challenge your views. So I don't agree with everything that P.G. Wodehouse conveyed in these novels, but I can still appreciate good craft and good humor. I think this one was meant to be a little earlier. I was trying to do these 10 in some kind of order, but this is number 592, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is just great. It's a classic ghost story, and for good reason. And what you might find surprising about this is that it is so ambivalent. There's so many unanswered questions, and we have a tale within a tale within a tale. There is all of these murky layers of sort of storytelling and questions of veracity and the paranormal, and of course what Derrida might call the ghostly demarcations, these kind of trembling border spaces between the sort of material and the immaterial. This is late Henry James style, so the sentences really curl and twist in on themselves. But don't be daunted by this. I mean, first of all, it's probably one of the shortest books in the Penguin 1000, and it's one of James's shortest books, probably up there or down there, whichever way you look at it, with Daisy Miller. It didn't exactly send cold shivers, through my bones, but it is obviously spooky. Scholars have been debating for more than a century about
what this story really means and what James was trying to achieve through it. Now, I've gone a little bit out of order here, and I don't have the number of this book right in front of me, but I'm going to discuss the selected prose of T.S. Eliot. Now, I was very happy to see this in the 1000. I love to read poetics and literary criticism, and I am also an admirer of T.S. Eliot in general. He's a lot more sort of traditional and religious and sort of pious than I aspire to be. But you can really learn so much from his very deep and wide reading and his essays, his reviews, his lectures, his letters. And I was so happy to see that there was a bit of this in the 1000 because there's not quite enough of these kind of books for my liking. And now I don't actually have the Penguin selected prose, but I do have, and it was under the phone as well with the big fat Graham Greene behemoth. So, but I had to grab this one to show you. It is actually got the same title. It's the selected prose of T.S. Eliot. This one was published by Faber and Faber and edited by Frank Kermode. He's a very eminent literary critic in his own right. And I'm sort of discussing this as a placeholder for the Penguin selected prose of T.S. Eliot because in general when Eliot published collections of his prose, there was a lot of repetition. So almost all of his major works were sort of reprinted in various collections. So, I mean, there's The Sacred Wood, and then there's Homage to John Dryden, there's selected essays, there's Lancelot Andrews, there's Thoughts After Lambeth, there's more selected essays, there's the use of poetry and the use of criticism, essays ancient and modern, After Strange Gods, on and on and on. So many of his essays were reprinted in these various collections. So I, without having seen the table of contents of the Penguin selected prose, I know that the meat and bones, really like the bulk and the heart of it is probably also in this one. It's really, really fantastic stuff. We've got reflections on Vers Libre. We've got the Metaphysical Poets, which is really good. It was his reappraisal of the so-called metaphysical poets, John Donne, Andrew Marvell, and co. And he had quite a big influence on bringing them back into the fold, as it were, and for good reason. They'd kind of fallen out of fashion, but he makes a strong case in that essay for their inclusion in the canon. The use of poetry and the use of criticism is a brilliant essay. What is a classic? And then he also has his short piece on James Joyce's Ulysses, Order and Myth. He's got writing on Dante, on Andrew Marvell, some reflections on Henry James and Ezra Pound, Tradition and the Individual Talent, his essay on Hamlet, in which he claims that Hamlet is not a very good work of literature. So he has some quite strong opinions. I often disagree with him, but he also has some really, really powerful, he really has some really powerful ideas. He talks a lot about receptivity, surrender. He talks about the role of the artist and the role of the critic in parallel terms. And he has this kind of 3-step plan. He talks about surrendering, so that the critic or the artist, upon first encountering a new idea or inspiration in the case of the artist, or encountering a work of literature or a work of art to be criticized, the first thing to do is surrender. And by that he means don't think too much, just encounter the work with an open mind, be in touch with your feelings. It's about affect, it's about emotional response and receptivity, and not immediately trying to analyze or understand or get the meaning or look for symbols. Just encounter it with an openness, and that is going to give you the deepest contact with this work of art. Then, having done that, you go away from it, from the novel or the poem or the song or whatever the painting or the sculpture. Go away from it, and this is what he calls recovery. And this is when it settles in your subconscious. You start to form links within your own sort of constellation of your own reading and your learning. How does this text fit in with others that you've read or encountered? And this is when you start to process it and sort of digest your experience. And then the third step is in the case of the critic, is articulation. So now you bring to bear that experience, that process of the work, and you try and get as close to remembering that surrender and recapture that surrender, and then articulate it using your intelligence into a cohesive, coherent argument or appraisal. And that is when you do a lot of analysis and comparison between other works within the tradition. And then, of course, the third step from the artistic point of view is to write the poem, right? Bring your craft or your paintbrushes, your musical acumen, bring that to bear, and again try and get close to that feeling of surrender, but from a more rational and sort of calculated approach. But yeah, selected prose of T.S. Eliot. There's loads of good stuff, and I'm sure that when I get hold of the Penguin selected prose, I will look through the table of contents, and I would imagine there's a huge amount of overlap. So yeah, that's the 10 penguins for today's episode. There's still 97 episodes to go, so we're going to be coming back and doing this. I would love to hear from you. What did you think of these books? What did you think of this video? Please let me know if you've read any of these and what you think of them. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. So thanks very much. Speak to you soon.